Middle of the 18th century, Glasgow had a population of around 20,000, but in just under a century it had grown to around 300,000 and became one of Scotland's largest cities. And one of the main reasons behind this was America, or more specifically, trade with America. England and Scotland united in 1707, Scottish merchants were given access to all of England's colonies in America. And because Glasgow is situated on the River Clyde, where trade winds often brought ships, they were in a perfect location. Some Glaswegians benefited a great deal. For instance, in the early 18th century, there were the Tobacco Lords, a group of Glaswegian merchants who had a monopoly over the tobacco trade. And one, named John Glassford, had a fleet of about 25 ships at his disposal, and in the 1770s traded around £500,000 each year. Many buildings in Glasgow, like the Museum of Modern Art and St Andrews in the Square, were built by these merchants. But the American Revolution changed all that, and they were no longer able to control the tobacco trade, but some Scottish merchants still made money in Canada. In Canada, they set up the Beaver Club, and merchants like Simon McTavish was able to export around £250,000 of pelts each year. Plus, here along the Clyde, huge sugar warehouses were built. So it's no surprise, if you put the sugar warehouses in with the tobacco trade, that Glasgow, like many of Britain's west coast cities like Liverpool and Bristol, was heavily involved in the slave trade. In fact, here in Glasgow there are streets named Jamaica Street and Virginia Street to show you this legacy. But Glaswegian merchants were involved in all aspects of the slave trade. For instance, there was a company called Grant Oswald and Company that bought Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, and from there slaves were shipped from Africa over to America. The slaves were also brought over to America with a Scottish-made fabric called Osnaburg, and this is the sort of material that the majority of slaves in the Caribbean and Southern America had to wear. But the Scottish also had plantations, especially in Jamaica, where it's estimated around half of the population have Scottish surnames. It's true that many Scottish people were sent over to Jamaica as indentured servants, but these, largely in the 17th century, were Covenanters and had surnames like Marshall and Martins. But one of the most common surnames in Jamaica is Campbell, and the Campbells arrived in Jamaica in the 18th century. Plus, there's also a town called Culloden, which shows that the Scots who founded that town arrived after 1745. It's estimated that around a third of the plantations in Jamaica were owned by Scottish people, and one interesting legacy of the Scottish involvement in the slave trade in Jamaica is the Rasta hat is called a tam in Jamaica, and it looks remarkably like the female version of the tam o' shanter. Plus, in 1833, when slavery was abolished, many slave owners were granted reparations, and some of them were given tens of millions of pounds, and this was the single largest government payout until the bailing out of the banks quite recently. But we know where the people who received these reparations lived, and, well, disproportionately many of them came from Scotland. And although Edinburgh had more slave owners than Glasgow, Glasgow still had a large proportion of slave owners.